The candles floated low over the Gryffindor table, and the pumpkins were grinning, and the enchanted ceiling showed stars that nobody in the hall was looking at. The Halloween feast smelled of roast meat and warm bread, and Harry was not paying attention to any of that. He was watching the Goblet of Fire. It sat at the head of the hall on its stone podium, throwing blue-white light across the nearest faces, turning skin pale and strange, making the shadows under eyes look deeper. The Beauxbatons girls had clustered near the Ravenclaw table in their silk robes, watching the goblet with a focused stillness. The Durmstrang students sat in a solid, dark block near the Slytherins, and Victor Crumb sat at their centre like a famous stone, the kind people pointed at from a distance and whispered about. Harry had watched Crumb catch snitches at the World Cup in August. He had not put his own name in. He was 14. "Do you think the flame is meant to be that white?" Hermione said, leaning over her goblet of pumpkin juice, her bushy brown hair tucked behind both ears. She was not talking to Ron. Ron, on Harry's other side, was eating in a practiced, pointed silence. "It was blue earlier," Harry said. "That means it's deciding, processing the entries, then selecting." She sat back. The original goblet in 1294 apparently took 3 days. She stopped. The great hall had gone very quiet. The flame had turned deep, burning red. Every person in the hall felt it before they saw it. A drop in the noise, a change in the air, 1,000 people pulling in breath at once. A tongue of flame shot upward, and a charred slip of parchment came tumbling out of the fire. Dumbledore caught it. He stood tall and still in robes of midnight blue, and read the name aloud, his voice carrying without effort. "The Durmstrang champion, Victor Krum." The Durmstrang table erupted, and most of the hall with it. Krum rose and walked toward the chamber at the back of the room without looking left or right, and Harry watched him go because watching was easier than thinking. The second parchment came. Fleur Delacour, Beauxbaton, silvery blonde, luminously beautiful, the kind of presence that seemed to alter the quality of light around her. She walked with her chin up and disappeared through the door. The third, Cedric Diggory. Hufflepuff exploded with noise. Cedric stood, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the kind of handsome that looked unintentional, and when he raised a hand, his face was flushed and genuinely pleased, not performing it. Harry found himself clapping. Then the goblet's flame went dark. 3 schools, 3 champions. Around Harry, the hall began to stir and breathe again. He started to exhale. The flame came back red. Everyone who had begun to move froze. The red was different, deeper, hotter, almost orange at the edges, burning with a steadiness the first 3 names hadn't had. Another slip of parchment tumbled out. Dumbledore's hand came up and caught it. He looked at it for a long moment. He turned it over. He looked at it again. "Harry Potter." The silence was total and strange, the kind only a hall full of people deliberately holding still can produce. Denser than emptiness, heavier. Harry heard his own name from every direction at once, reverberating off the stone walls and the ceiling and 1,000 faces, and then Hermione's hand closed around his wrist. "Harry!" Very quiet. "Go up!" He stood. He didn't understand it yet, at the level that would allow him to feel something. He understood the mechanics, his name, the goblet, the thing that was not supposed to happen, but none of it had reached whatever part of him produced feeling. He walked toward the front of the hall anyway. Dumbledore was watching him with something behind the blue eyes that was not quite surprise, and not quite its absence either. He went through the chamber door. The back chamber smelled of old stone and candle wax. Krum stood near the fire with his arms crossed, heavy brows drawn together, watching Harry enter. Fleur Delacour stood slightly apart. Cedric looked up from the fire, and something moved across his face before he settled it. "Did you put your name in?" Cedric asked. "No," Harry said. Cedric nodded once. The adults came through. Dumbledore, Bagman, Bartemius, Crouch Senior, Karkaroff, Madame Maxim, and Cornelius Fudge, who took one look at Harry and immediately looked at everyone else, as though hoping one of them would volunteer to handle it. Professor Moody came last, his wooden leg loud on stone. His magical blue eye swept the room, and then settled on Harry with an unsettling patience. Karkaroff was speaking before the door had fully closed. 3 champions, he said, established tradition, a violation. The goblet made its selection, Dumbledore said quietly. We must honor it. The goblet's decision was magically binding. Dumbledore explained this with the precision of a man delivering news he himself did not welcome. The contract could not be undone. To refuse was to breach it, and the magical consequences of that breach were not something anyone was prepared to test. Harry was 14 years old, 3 years below the minimum age, and he was going to have to compete in a tournament that had once been discontinued because people died. Someone entered his name, Crouch said, flatly, to the air in front of him. The goblet does not do that on its own. No, Dumbledore said. It does not. Nobody produced an answer for that. The meeting ended without one. The common room had heard before Harry arrived. He could tell by the way the noise shifted when he came through the portrait hole. The pause, the turn of attention, and then an uneven outbreak of clapping near the fire. Fred and George, predictably. The applause spread with the uncertainty of people unsure whether to celebrate or commiserate, who had decided celebration was safer. Harry stood in the middle of it and felt nothing much. He found Ron near the stairs. Ron was standing with his arms loose at his sides, and the expression Harry recognized, a decision already made, before the person it concerned had arrived. "How did you do it, then?" Ron said. "I didn't." Something moved behind his blue eyes and went still. "Right," he said, and went up the stairs. The word sat in the air after him with all the warmth of a closed door. Hermione found Harry's elbow a while later and said the things that could be said. The age line should have made it impossible. Someone had circumvented it deliberately. Dumbledore would investigate. Harry listened. He knew she was right, and he knew she was trying. He stood in the common room until the noise settled, and then he went up. The dormitory was dark. Harry sat on the edge of his bed without lighting a lamp and thought about Sirius. Not the wanted poster Sirius, the hollow-faced man the prophet ran, with the long, filthy hair and the eyes of someone who had lived somewhere very cold for a very long time. The other Sirius, the one in the old photographs, laughing next to Harry's father with the ease of someone who expected good things. Harry had a godfather he had never spoken to, not properly, not once, and that godfather was in Azkaban and could not be reached by owl or letter or any ordinary means. There was no postal route to Azkaban. There was no address. Sirius would not know about tonight, would not know that someone had entered Harry's name in a tournament designed for trained adults, would not know that Harry had just been told he had no choice but to compete. And if he did know, there was nothing he could do. Harry lay back without getting undressed and looked at the dark ceiling. He thought about a home offered once that he had never been able to go to, from a man who couldn't write back. Down in the owlery, the birds slept on their perches with their heads tucked beneath their wings. A fast owl arrived a little past midnight, a press bird bearing the prophet's red leg band and a sealed canister marked urgent. It dropped the canister into the sorting rack and slept. Inside, the overnight special edition dispatched to every subscription address on the prophet's rolls. The headline was readable in the moonlight through the owlery's high arches. Potter shocks Triwizard. Fourth champion selected, and beneath it, exclusive by our tournament correspondent, Rita Skeeter. By morning, it would be on every breakfast table in Wizarding Britain. By morning, it would have reached places Harry had never been, people he had never met, and further still, along routes that ran cold and long, to addresses considerably more remote than any breakfast table. The owls slept. Outside, the Scottish night was clear, and the stars were real ones, not conjured. The grey came in at the seam between the door and the wall. Not sunlight. There was no sunlight in Azkaban. Not properly. Not for 13 years. But the differential grey, slightly lighter near the feeding slot where the colour of day was not so much seen as sensed. A brightening of the dark that indicated the world outside was continuing, indifferently, without him. Sirius had learned to read it in the first year. By the 5th, he could not have said how he knew. By the 13th, it no longer required effort. The cell smelled of the sea, not the sea as you remembered it from outside, that clean, cold, open thing, the salt spray and the distance, but the underneath of it, the brine and rot that saturated every stone of the island, the smell of a place that had been cold and wet so long it had stopped trying to be anything else. The Dementors moved in the corridor beyond the door, and you did not hear them so much as feel them. The temperature dropping, the warmth leaving your chest, the thoughts going grey at the edges the way old photographs go grey. Memory was what they took first, not destroyed, taken of its feeling, left as outline. By the 13th year, there were things Sirius could not reach properly anymore. James's laugh, the colour of the motorbike's headlamp on a country road at 3 in the morning. He kept the essential things by repetition. He said them to himself in the dark. My name is Sirius Black. I did not kill Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew is alive. I know he is alive, because if he were dead, I would be guilty, and I am not guilty. The Dementors could take the feeling out of a memory, leave the outline without the warmth, but they could not take the fact. He held facts like stones in the dark. He had been doing it for 13 years. In 3 days it would be November the 3rd. He had spent his 22nd birthday through his 34th behind this door. 13 birthdays. He knew the number exactly. He had counted in year 4, when counting still felt like resistance, and again in year 7 when he needed something to do with his mind, and again at 10 just to verify. He was going to turn 35 on the 3rd. The thing slid under the door just before dawn. Not food. Food came at a different hour. This was a folded page. The Daily Prophet masthead, visible even in the grey, slid through the gap by the guard who had been bringing occasional newspapers for the past 2 years, for reasons Sirius had never fully determined. A small irregular mercy, or indifference, or boredom. He did not examine it closely. He was grateful for the newspapers the way you are grateful for the specific things that keep you in contact with the fact that the world exists. He sat for a moment without picking it up. Then he did. The front page, the headline. He read it. He read it again. Not because he was uncertain what it said, but because his mind, dulled by grey and cold and years of Dementor proximity, required the second pass before it would commit the words to the layer below reading, where meaning lived. Potter shocks Triwizard. 4th champion selected. Harry, age 14. An unexpected 4th name from the Goblet of Fire on the night of October 31st. He sat with the paper on his knees for a while. His hands were very thin. He noticed them from time to time, the change from what they had been, and they were not quite steady. He looked at the photograph of Harry. The boy in the great hall with the cameras going off around him, looking like he wanted very much to be elsewhere. He had James's hair. He had Lily's eyes, the article noted. He had not put his name in the goblet. He was 14 years old and 3 years below the age line. Someone else had put his name in. The tournament had killed people in its previous iterations. That was why it had been suspended for centuries. The age restriction was not bureaucratic caution. It was the minimum requirement to survive the tasks. And now someone had arranged for a 14-year-old boy to enter it. This 14-year-old boy. He set the paper down on the stone floor. He looked at it there. 13 years. He had waited in this cell through 13 years without anything to wait for, except his own innocence. The knowledge he kept by repetition, held like stones, that Peter was alive, that Sirius was not what the world said he was, and that this couldn't go on forever. It had gone on forever. Until this morning, it had been going on forever. Peter was alive. Peter was alive and in the world somewhere, in whatever form he had taken to survive these 13 years. Whatever shape, whatever name, whatever face. And Harry was in a tournament that could kill him, and Peter was the kind of man who attached himself to whichever power was rising. 13 years ago, that power had been Voldemort. Someone had dropped Harry Potter's name into the goblet of fire. That was not coincidence. That was not a prank by a schoolboy. That was someone who wanted Harry in that tournament, and in that tournament you could die, and Sirius was going to leave this cell tonight. He shifted. The animagus transformation, after 13 years, was the only thing that still came easily. The body remembered what the mind had to work to hold. In this form, there was less for the Dementors to find. A dog's emotional register was simpler, harder to locate, less of a signal for them to fix on. Not invisible. He had never made the mistake of believing Padfoot was invisible to them, but less present. They moved past him sometimes in the corridor, their cold reaching toward him, and passed on to the greater warmth in the next cell without quite stopping. He crouched in the far corner of the cell, pressed against the stone, and waited. The feeding slot opened before dawn. A mechanical process, the guards used a long-reach mechanism, did not handle the slot themselves. And in dog form, 13 years of starvation and thinning having reduced him past what his human frame had been, he fit through the gap. He had thought about this for years. He had calculated it in year 3, and then refused to dwell on it, because dwelling would have made it too important, and he had to survive the waiting. He had calculated correctly. He fit. The corridor was empty. The cold was total. He ran. Past the other cells, past the sound of breathing from behind closed doors. He did not think about the breathing. Past the angle of the passage toward the outer door that was not locked against a dog, because nothing escaped Azkaban, and they had not prepared for this specific form of escape, and through and out into the air. The sea smell hit him differently than it did through the wall. This was the surface of it, alive, cold, enormous, and the island was black rock in the pre-dawn, and the Dementors were circling the outer perimeter, slow and drifting in the dark, and he ran for the edge without breaking stride, because stopping would be fatal, and he went over the lip of the island and into the North Sea. The cold was not like the cell cold. The cell was a dry absence of warmth. This was physical. It went through the fur and through the skin and into the muscle and did not stop there, and his paws were moving before his mind had decided they were moving. A mechanical rhythm, the body's last resource. Keep moving or die. The current hit him, and he went through it. He did not think. He swam. He did not know how long the crossing took. longer than thought. Long enough that thought became unnecessary, and there was only the rhythm of pause and the weight of wet fur and the cold that had gone past pain into something more fundamental, a condition rather than a sensation. He came up onto a rocky shore as the sky began to lighten in the east, dark stones under his paws, the smell of heather somewhere above on the hill, the sea behind him, and real ground ahead. He lay down. His sides were moving too fast. The ground was under him. Not stone, not island, not corridor. Ground. Actual earth with actual distance stretching out from it in all directions. No walls, no slot, no door, no grey. He lay there until his sides slowed. He listened to the sound of the water behind him, receding with the current, and the sound of nothing else. Then he got up. He pointed himself northwest, toward the hills and the long road north, and he began. The morning edition of the Daily Prophet reached the Gryffindor table with breakfast on the 1st of November, and Harry's face looked up at him from the front page. He had known it would be there. Rita Skeeter had been in the hall the night before, notebook in hand, quick quotes quill moving faster than anyone was talking. A journalist's instinct for the story that finds you whether or not you want to be found. The photograph showed him in the back chamber, mid-expression, looking caught. The headline above it, Harry Potter, 14, named Triwizard Champion, Hogwarts student, defies age line in shock selection. He did not read the article. He could reconstruct what it said from the way the table looked at him. Not all of them. Neville, sitting 2 seats down with his bowl of porridge, glanced up and gave Harry a nod that was trying to be normal and almost made it. Ginny, across the table and a year younger, watched him with her chin tucked and an expression he could not pass. The Gryffindor 7th years were the most uncomfortable, old enough to calculate what entering the tournament actually meant, but too young to know what to do with that calculation. Ron's seat was empty. He had come down to breakfast before Harry and chosen a spot at the far end of the table, far enough that the distance was unmistakable, and close enough that Harry could see him not looking. It was a specific kind of not looking, the kind that required effort, that meant the person doing it was very aware of exactly where to point their eyes to avoid a place. Ron was tall enough that the deliberate angle of his head above the Gryffindor scarf was easy to read across the hall. Hermione sat down beside Harry without comment. She poured herself pumpkin juice, set the jug down, and opened her own copy of the Prophet to a page that was not the front page. She did not say anything about Ron. Harry did not either. That was the arrangement, reached without discussion. He ate what he could, which was not much. The second story broke on the morning of November 2nd. Harry saw it first in the way the hall changed, a ripple of noise starting near the Slytherin table where the owls had landed earliest, moving through the room in the way that significant news moves through an enclosed space, too fast to be ordinary gossip. He caught the headline over the shoulder of a 5th-year Hufflepuff who had gone very still. Sirius Black escapes Azkaban, second breakout in wizarding history. The smaller print, audacious escape discovered dawn of November 1st. Prison authorities confirm cell found empty. Minister Fudge to make statement. The paper shook slightly in the 5th year's hands. Harry looked at it and read it twice, and then put down his fork and sat quietly while the hall went loud around him. The date. November 1st, the night after his name came out of the goblet. He did not say this at breakfast. He filed it away instead, somewhere behind his teeth, and waited. Fudge's response was visible by afternoon. Harry saw it from the windows of the Charms corridor, black shapes gathering at the perimeter of the grounds, slow and sliding over the grass near the tree line, with the particular dragging movement of things that are not quite animals and not quite anything else. Dementors, at least a dozen, spreading themselves at intervals along the school boundary in the grey November light, their cloaks moving without wind. A ministry response to a ministry problem. Fudge was at Hogwarts for the tournament, and had, apparently, decided that the most visible possible response was also the most reassuring one. Harry was not reassured. He watched them from the charms window for a moment, the way you watch something dangerous from behind glass, aware of the glass as a courtesy rather than a guarantee, and then turned away. He found Hermione in the library that evening, at the table near the restricted section where it was quietest. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "The date," he said. She closed her book. Sirius Black escaped the night the prophet ran the story. The night the prophet ran my name. He kept his voice low, which was not difficult because the library was nearly empty. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Hermione said. "It isn't." "He didn't escape for himself. He escaped last year in POA. "No, he didn't. He didn't escape at all. He's been there the whole time. And then my name goes in the goblet, and the prophet carries it, and the next morning, he's gone." Harry heard how it sounded when he said it aloud. It sounded like the kind of thing you would not believe if you hadn't already been thinking it since breakfast. "He escaped because of me." Hermione was quiet for a moment. She had the look she got when she was checking the logic of something, not doubting it specifically, but verifying the structure before she committed her weight to it. "The timing is, yes. It's very deliberate, or it appears deliberate. But I think appearing deliberate is precisely what it is." She folded her hands on the closed book. "He's your godfather. He's a convicted murderer, technically. Technically, yes." She said this the way she said things she considered provisional, not dismissing it, just accurately labeling it. "I think the timing is what it is." Harry looked at the wall of books over her shoulder. He thought about the dormitory last night, the dark ceiling, the thought of a man in a cell you couldn't write to. He had gone to sleep thinking that Sirius would not know. He had been wrong about that. "Good," he said finally. It was not a complicated feeling. He held it for a moment, and then let it sit. Somewhere in the Highlands, the night of November 3rd, a large black dog was moving along a ridge above a glen, the heather crushed flat by frost. The hills were dark and enormous, and indifferent in the way that wild places are indifferent, not hostile, not welcoming, simply present. The dog moved steadily, stopping now and then to lift its head to the wind. It was, in the dog's internal calendar, a particular day. The 3rd of November. The 35th time, though the last 13 of those times the ground had been stone, and the air had been Azkaban grey, and the day had been the same as all the others because there were no others, only the grey and the cold, and the days that were years. This day the ground was heather and frost. The dog moved on. "First task, November 24th, Professor McGonagall announced to the school at dinner. "Champions are advised to review the tournament rules. All champions are excused from end-of-term examinations where the task dates conflict." 24th of November. 3 weeks. Harry looked at his plate. 3 weeks to prepare for a task he had not entered and knew nothing about. He wrote these facts down mentally, in the same place he kept the other facts. Sirius is out. The timing is not a coincidence. Sirius is coming here. 24th of November. In defense against the dark arts, the following morning, Professor Moody walked slowly between the rows of desks with his wooden leg marking time on the stone floor. He was demonstrating the counterjinx to a hex Harry had never heard of, his voice rough and methodical, and the blue magical eye in his face was moving independently of everything else he did, sweeping the room in long, slow arcs from wall to wall, from ceiling to floor, from the door to the windows to the back of the room. It moved the way eyes move when they are not reading the room for interest, but for information. It stopped. It stopped at Harry, very briefly, before resuming its arc. The lesson continued. Harry took notes. He did not look up. But he felt it. The way you feel someone standing behind you in the dark before you turn around. He wrote 3 words in the margin of his notes. The eye stopped. He looked at them for a moment, then closed the notebook. He came into Hogsmeade from the north in the early morning of the 4th of November, and stayed low. A stray dog on the edge of a wizarding village was not unremarkable. Strays passed through everywhere, and in Padfoot's form, with the fur matted from the crossing and the frame beneath it stripped past lean, he looked less like a large pedigree animal than like something that had been surviving on its own for a long time. Which was accurate. He worked the street carefully, nose down, reading the morning. The 3 broomsticks had a bin outside the back door, where yesterday's newspapers ended up with the kitchen scraps. He overturned it in the grey before anyone was awake, and lay down in the alley with the papers spread before him, reading in that particular way. The dog's stillness, and the human's eyes. That was one of the stranger things about being an animagus, that your mind did not change when your body did. He read every scrap he could find. The tournament. The escape. Sirius Black. Where is he now? With a photograph of a cell on the island, the door standing open, the feeding slot visible in the bottom of the frame. He looked at that photograph for a while. The hog's head on the other side of the village yielded 2 more issues, and half a meat pasty that he ate without much attention to the taste. The tournament coverage was extensive. The 4th champion coverage was more extensive. Harry's photograph appeared on 3 front pages in 5 days, with expressions ranging from dazed to braced to something that was trying to be composed and not fully achieving it. He read the Rita Skeeter articles. They were inaccurate about most things, and could not be inaccurate about Harry's name in the goblet and Harry's age, because those facts were what the story was, and filed what was useful and left the rest. He found the cave on the 5th, by instinct more than method. A dog's nose for dry ground in wet rock, the particular smell of a sheltered space that had been empty long enough for the damp to settle and dry again, above the village on the hillside, far enough from the road that no one would have reason to go there. The mouth of it faced away from the wind. Inside, the stone was cold, but not island cold. Not cell cold. He curled into the far corner in Padfoot form, and slept for the first time since the crossing that was not the sleep of exhaustion, but simply sleep. He woke to darkness, and a view that stopped him. From the mouth of the cave, across the valley and the intervening dark, Hogwarts was lit. Not fully, not every window, but the towers showed light, and the great hall's high windows threw a glow that reached the water of the lake below, and the whole of it sat up there in the black November hills, like something that had grown out of the rock and decided to stay. He had seen it before. He had been a student there. But seeing it from outside, from the wrong side of the valley, from a hillside cave in Padfoot form, with 13 years of Azkaban behind him, and no wand and no legal right to exist freely in this country. Seeing it like that was different. He could see, at the school's edge, the dark shapes moving, slow and spreading. The Dementors at the perimeter, circling in their dragging way, stationed at intervals Fudge's people had arranged. Between him and Harry was the valley and the lake and those shapes, and he was on the wrong side of all of it. He lay down at the cave mouth and watched the lights. Inside the castle, In a room near the trophy room that the tournament organizers had commandeered for champions' meetings, Harry was sitting in a chair that was too formal for him, listening to instructions about the first task that were not instructions, because Crouch and Bagman kept carefully avoiding saying what the first task was. Rules, regulations, the importance of competing with honor. Harry watched the ceiling. Moody stood in the corner throughout, leaning on his staff, his scarred face angled away. But the blue magical eye, the one that moved independently and saw through walls and, reputedly, through invisibility cloaks, was not following the speakers. It was watching Harry. Not the way a teacher watches a student they are concerned about. The way a man watches something he is calculating. Harry noticed and then looked at the ceiling again. He thought, 3 weeks. Down in the boys' dormitory, 2 floors above the common room, Ron was doing homework with Scabbers in his lap. This was not unusual. Scabbers had spent the better part of 3 years sleeping in Ron's pockets or lying on his books, a small warm weight, occasionally inconvenient. Ron had long since stopped thinking about it. He noticed, around the second hour of the evening, that Scabbers was not doing what Scabbers usually did, which was sleep. He was crouched very still in the exact center of Ron's lap, which was itself unusual. Usually he arranged himself in a corner, and he was not moving at all, not even the small, unconscious movements of a sleeping animal. He was still in the specific way that prey animals go still. Ron shifted, and the rat's claws tightened slightly on his robes. "All right, Scabbers," Ron said. Not really to anyone. The rat's eyes were pointed at the window. Ron glanced at the window. It was a dark November evening. Nothing beyond the glass except the grounds and the dark. He looked back down at Scabbers, who had not moved. He was probably getting old, Ron told himself. Rats didn't live long. He'd had Scabbers for going on 3 years already, and the twins had had him for years before that. He gathered the rat up and put him back in the cage and latched it, and Scabbers huddled in the far corner and stared at the cage wall. Ron looked at him for a moment, then went back to his homework. When full dark fell and the castle lights dimmed, Sirius shifted into human form in the back of the cave. He had eaten, he had gotten better at finding food, which was a bleak sort of improvement. And he was cold in the way he was always cold now, a coldness that seemed to sit in the bones rather than on the skin. He sat with his knees up and his back against the stone, and looked at his hands. Peter. He turned the name over the way he had turned it over for 13 years, in the dark, between the facts. Peter Pettigrew was alive. He was alive because Sirius was not guilty, and Sirius knew he was not guilty, and that meant Peter was alive and in the world, and had been for all of this, for all 13 years, while Sirius was in the cell and Harry was somewhere he didn't know, growing up somewhere he wasn't. In what shape, he didn't know. In what form, under what name, attached to what new power, he didn't know. He watched the distant lights of the castle and tried to work out the shape of a man he had known at 17. He could not go to the castle. Not yet. Too gaunt, too visible, and no wand. Without a wand he was a dog and a pair of hands and nothing else, and the perimeter of Dementors would register a human crossing the grounds at speed. He was waiting for something he could not name yet, a way in that didn't cost more than he could afford to spend. He sat there until the lights in the towers went out one by one, and then he shifted again, and slept. In the dormitory, Harry was almost asleep when the thought came, as it sometimes did at the edge of sleep. His parents. He didn't dream about them often, and didn't try to control when he did. Tonight the thought was just there. His father's face from the photographs, his mother's from the mirror, and then, drifting underneath it, the other thought. Sirius was out there. He was out there somewhere in the dark, and the dark here was the same dark, and there was a sense Harry couldn't have articulated, somewhere between a sound and a pressure, that the distance between them was not as large as it had been. He pulled the blanket up and lay looking at the ceiling. He could not explain it. He had never met the man, not consciously, but the castle had a sound when it settled in cold weather, a sound below hearing that you felt in the floor, and Harry had always been able to feel it even in sleep. He felt something like that now. He did not know what to do with it, so he let it stay, and slept. He had been watching the hut for 2 nights before he went to it. It sat at the edge of the castle grounds, separated from the main building by distance, and a pumpkin patch that was, by November, mostly bare stalks and frozen earth. A lamp burned in the single window most evenings. Sometimes the door opened, and a figure came out, enormous, the bulk of him unmistakable even from the hillside above Hogsmeade, to check on something in the yard, or to carry feed toward the edge of the forbidden forest. Sirius watched him from above in Padfoot form, and felt something in his chest that was not quite pain, and not quite relief, but was adjacent to both. Hagrid. Rubeus Hagrid, who had pulled Harry out of the wreckage of Godric's Hollow and ridden Sirius's own motorbike to take him away, and Sirius had let him, had been too shattered by what had happened in the space of that hour to do anything except stand in the road and watch the bike go. On the 3rd night, he came down. He scratched at the hut's door from the step, once, then waited. A long pause. Then the door opened, and the light spilled out, and Hagrid stood there, enormous in the doorway, nearly filling it, his shaggy hair and beard making him look larger than the frame, looking down at a large black dog on his step, with an expression that moved through surprise and confusion, and then stopped at something that was not quite either. He said very quietly, "Padfoot." He had recognized the dog. In 13 years without seeing him, Hagrid had remembered the specific size and shape and color of Sirius Black's animagus form. Sirius thought, of course he had. Of course. He shifted. The transformation happened in the spill of lamplight from the doorway, and Hagrid made a sound, not words, something before words. And then his enormous hand was on Sirius's arm, and he was being pulled inside, and the door was closing, and the warmth of the hut was hitting him all at once, after the cold of the November night. He became aware, immediately, that standing required more effort than it should. He sat down on the stone floor without quite meaning to. Hagrid crouched beside him, which brought his face to approximately Sirius's eye level, which gave some measure of just how large Hagrid actually was. His black beetle eyes were very bright. He said, "You look," and then stopped, because the end of that sentence was apparently something he did not know how to complete diplomatically. "I know," Sirius said. Hagrid's face did what Hagrid's face did, which was show everything that was happening in him. It creased and reddened, and something spilled over. He was crying within about 30 seconds, which was more or less what Sirius had expected. He sat on the floor and let Hagrid cry, and felt, strangely, that this was the correct response to 13 years. Someone should cry. Hagrid produced food, eventually, as Hagrid always had. Large rock cakes on a plate, grey-brown and dense, the kind that required more commitment than appetite. Sirius ate 3 of them without complaint. The warmth of the hut and the specific comfort of being inside a place where someone knew him made the rock cakes considerably more acceptable than they would otherwise have been. "I need to tell you something," Sirius said. "And then I need you to tell me if any part of it connects to something you know." Hagrid nodded, large hands wrapped around a teacup. "Peter Pettigrew is alive." Hagrid went still. "I know he is," Sirius said, "because I am not guilty. I know what I did, and what I did not do, and everything I did not do. Peter did. He was the Potter's secret keeper, not me. They switched at the last minute, and we kept it quiet, and he sold them to Voldemort and then framed me for it. He faked his death in the street the next morning, cut off his own finger, and blew up a road and left. He has been alive and hiding for 13 years, and I do not know where." He let that settle. Hagrid was very still in the way that large things go still when they are absorbing something. "When Harry's name came out of that goblet," Sirius continued, "someone put it there. Someone with access to the tournament and a reason to want Harry dead. And Peter has spent 30-odd years attaching himself to whichever power is rising. First Voldemort, and now, if Voldemort is moving again, Peter would be moving with him. He is not brave. He is a survivor. He finds the winning side, and he makes himself useful to it." Hagrid was looking at him with an expression that was working through the information, carefully, the way Hagrid always had thought, thoroughly and in order. "I don't know where Peter would be," Hagrid said slowly. "Can't say I'd—" "No." He stopped. He set his teacup down. Something had changed in his expression. Something arriving. "Hang on." Sirius waited. "Ron Weasley," Hagrid said. "Arthur's boy, second youngest. He's had a rat since before he started at Hogwarts. Got it from the twins, and the twins had had it years before that. Name of Scabbers." He paused. "Been with the family going on 12 years now." Sirius did not move. 12 years, he said. "For a rat," Hagrid said, and his voice had gone careful. "Which ought to live? Well, 3 years, maybe. 4 if you're lucky." Sirius was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. The movement cost him something. The room tilted slightly, and he put one hand on the table. But he was standing. "How many toes does this rat have?" Hagrid stared at him. I've never counted." "On the right front paw," Sirius said. "How many toes?" "I don't know, Sirius. I've never had occasion to—" "Find out." He heard the urgency in his own voice and could not moderate it. "Before you do anything else, before you say anything to anyone, find out. 1 toe will be missing. On the right front paw. If it is, then that rat is Peter Pettigrew. That is how he faked his death. He cut off his own finger and left it for the Ministry to find. And a missing human finger is a missing rat toe in animagus form." Hagrid sat very still for a very long moment. "Right," he said. He said it the way Hagrid said things when he was frightened, and bracing himself. "Right, I'll find out." "Quietly," Sirius said. "Don't spook the rat. Don't let him know anything is different. Just find a way to count." Hagrid nodded. He reached across the table and moved the plate of rock cakes towards Sirius in an instinctive domestic gesture. "You are here. You need feeding," and said, "He deserves to know you're here. Harry, he deserves to know." Sirius sat back down. "I know," he said. "I know he does." They came the next night, under an invisibility cloak. 3 of them, slightly too large for it, with someone's shoulder blade sticking out on the right side, where the fabric didn't quite reach. Hagrid had sent word via a school owl, a plain note that said only tonight, after 10, the usual path. Harry would know what it meant. Or he would find out. The door opened, and 3 pairs of feet shuffled in, and then the cloak came off, and there was Harry. Sirius had seen photographs. He had held the photographs, the ones Hagrid kept, the ones from the Order, the one of James and Lily's wedding, where Sirius stood at James's shoulder and grinned at the camera the way you grin when you are 21, and you think the worst thing that will ever happen has already been survived. He knew the face in those photographs, knew the dark, untidy hair and the green eyes. Knowing it and seeing it across a small stone room were different things. Harry was looking at him, in the way people look at something when they are not ready to look at it. The girl, Hermione, Sirius understood, was very still just behind Harry's left shoulder. The red-haired boy, Ron, had stopped in the doorway, with the cloak still half in his hands, and his face was doing several things at once, none of which were sulking. Sirius stood. He was aware of how he looked, gaunt, hollow-eyed, borrowed robes, the general appearance of someone who had spent the last 2 weeks running, but there was nothing to be done about that. He stood and looked at Harry, who was 14 years old, and had his mother's eyes exactly, and Sirius's chest did something large and unmanageable that he did not have language for, because Azkaban had taught him to get along without words for things. He crossed the room. He put his hand on Harry's shoulder. Not a hug. He did not have the right to a hug. Not yet. Not with 13 years of absence between them and nothing explained. Just his hand on Harry's shoulder. The grip that says, "I'm here. I'm actually here." Harry put his hand over Sirius's. He did not say anything. Neither did Sirius. Hagrid, behind them both, was crying again, which was not unexpected. Sirius sat on the floor again. It had become his position in the hut, the stone floor with his back against the wall, which was both honest and practical. And he told them the truth. All of it. From the beginning. He was not a Death Eater. He had never been a Death Eater, had never taken the mark, had spent the war doing the opposite. Work he could not describe in detail because some of those people were still alive, and the war was not over. It was just paused. James and Lily had needed a secret keeper, a single person whose knowledge of their hiding place was the only thing standing between them and Voldemort's ability to find them. The plan was always Sirius. Everyone assumed Sirius. Voldemort's people assumed Sirius. That was the problem. "I suggested the switch," he said. "It was my idea. I thought I was too obvious, too known, too expected. I thought if Voldemort came looking for me to get the secret, he'd find nothing, because I wouldn't have it. Peter was. Nobody was looking at Peter. Peter was overlooked. That was the whole point." He paused. "I chose the wrong man. I didn't know what Peter was. I thought I was protecting them." The hut was quiet. Harry was sitting on the bench across from Sirius, very still. Hermione was beside him. Ron was on the far side of the table with Scabbers in his lap, and the rat had not moved since they'd come in. Not the small, restless movement that animals make even in sleep. Not anything. Just stillness, and the occasional very slight trembling. "The morning after," Sirius said, "I went to find Peter. I'd already figured it out. I woke up knowing. Someone told Voldemort, and the only person who could have told him was the person who had the secret. And the person who had the secret was Peter." He looked at his hands. "I found him on a crowded street. He was faster than I expected. He started screaming that I'd betrayed them, loudly, in the street, before I could say anything. And then he blew up the road. 12 people died. He cut off his own finger and disappeared. Left the finger for the Ministry to find, so they'd think he was dead." He looked at Ron. "In human form, his right index finger is gone. In rat form, that maps directly to a toe. 1 toe missing, right front paw." Ron looked down at Scabbers. The silence that followed was the kind where everyone is waiting for the same person to do the thing that will make it real. Ron picked Scabbers up. The rat went rigid in his hands, not trying to escape, which a normal rat would do, but frozen, which was something else. Ron turned him over with the particular, careful deliberateness of someone who is not sure they want to find what they are looking for. He held the right front paw up to the lamp on Hagrid's table. He counted. He put Scabbers back down on the table very gently, which was strange, given what he was supposedly looking at, the gentleness was strange, and said, "That doesn't mean anything. A rat can lose a toe. It could have happened anywhere, in a fight, or trapped somewhere, or—" Nobody said anything. "He's been with our family since before I was born," Ron said. "Fred and George had him for years before they gave him to Percy. Percy had him before that, and then he gave him to me when he got an owl. 12 years in our house, in our pockets. He slept in my bed at the Burrow every summer." He stopped. He looked at Scabbers on the table, who was sitting with his back to all of them, hunched small, staring at the wall. The trembling had gone. The rat was absolutely still. "He's been sleeping in my bed." He said it in a tone that was not anger. It was something past anger, the place you get to after anger doesn't seem adequate to describe what has happened. "I know," Sirius said quietly. "He was in my bed," Ron said again, as if the second time might produce a response that the first time hadn't. He looked at Sirius, then at Harry, then back at the rat on the table. Something moved through his face and settled. He picked Scabbers up and put him back in his pocket with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. He said nothing else. Sirius straightened. "We should take him now. Tonight. Go straight to Dumbledore. Present Pettigrew in person." "You can't," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "If you walk into Dumbledore's office holding a rat, you're still Sirius Black. You're still a wanted man. Dumbledore might believe you. He might. But the Ministry's first move will be to take you in, not to listen to anything you say. You'd be back in Azkaban before Pettigrew was ever transformed in front of a witness." Harry's voice was level in the way it got when he was trying to think around something, rather than through it. "We need to deliver him in circumstances where they can't dismiss it. Not to Dumbledore's office in the middle of the night. Somewhere public, in front of people who count, where the Ministry can't bury it." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Hermione spoke carefully. "There's also the problem that as soon as a Ministry official sees you, they're legally required to act. It doesn't matter if you're holding Peter Pettigrew. Their first obligation is you. The Dementors on the perimeter aren't decoration. Fudge ordered them here specifically because of your escape." She had the expression she wore when she'd already worked through the logic and was presenting the conclusion for review. "We need to catch Pettigrew in a way that's witnessed by people who have no legal obligation to arrest you before they've seen what they're looking at." Sirius looked across the table at Harry, 14 years old and thinking like this. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what, exactly. But what came out was, "All right." "Don't spook him," Harry said, looking at Ron's pocket. "Don't change anything. He can't know we know." Ron nodded once, the short nod of someone accepting an assignment they did not ask for. He put his hand over his pocket briefly. The lump inside it was very still. "We'll wait for the right moment," Harry said. "The right place, something public enough that there's no explaining it away." Hagrid, who had been sitting very large and very quiet at the end of the table throughout all of this, said, "I'll keep an eye." He said it as simply as he said everything, as a statement of fact, a thing he would do, because it was the thing to do. They filed out under the cloak as the midnight bell rang from the castle. Across the great hall the following evening, at dinner, the magical blue eye in Professor Moody's face moved through its slow arc. The ceiling, the door, the Slytherin table, the staff table, back again. It was a continuous motion, unrelated to where Moody's real eye pointed, or where the conversation at the staff table was going. And then it slowed, and stopped. Harry Potter at the Gryffindor table, with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, 3 faces bent over their plates, speaking in the low-voiced way of people who are keeping something between themselves. The eye resumed its arc. At the staff table, the face above it didn't change expression. It simply ate its dinner. Harry walked back to the castle under the cloak, slightly ahead of Hermione and Ron, and thought about James and Lily. Not the abstract version, the photographs, the faces memorized from pictures because there was nothing else to memorize from. The specific thing Sirius had said tonight. I suggested the switch. I thought I was protecting them. He had carried that for 13 years, in a cell, knowing it was his idea, knowing that the man he had trusted with the most careful thing, the location of his 2 best friends and their infant son, had taken that trust and given it to Voldemort, and knowing, underneath all of it, that it was Sirius who had handed that trust over in the first place. Not with intention, not knowingly, but by choosing the wrong person. By being wrong about someone he'd known since he was 11 years old. Harry did not know what to do with that. It was not a clean grief, not a simple one. It had too many directions. It was the grief of a story that had been going on for 13 years before he understood that it was happening, involving people already gone or changed by the time he arrived at the part that involved him. He had been 1 year old. He had not been present for any of the choosing. He had had no choice in any of it, and neither, in some ways, had Sirius. He walked through the dark grass and thought, Sirius chose wrong and spent 13 years paying for it in a cell, and my parents died, and I grew up at the Dursleys without knowing any of this, and Peter Pettigrew has been sleeping in Ron Weasley's pocket for 12 years, and none of it is finished. He didn't know what a grief with that many angles was supposed to feel like. He just carried it across the dark grounds toward the castle, under the cloak, with the stars out and the Dementors at the perimeter moving in their slow, endless way, and let it be the shape it was. The second full week of November, and the cave had become a kind of home. Not comfortable. Cold stone, the smell of frost coming in off the hillside, the particular quality of damp that soaks into everything eventually. But familiar, which was a different thing. Sirius knew the shape of it by now in the dark. He knew which section of the floor was flattest, which part of the ceiling dripped when it rained. He had learned the cave the way he had learned the cell, by necessity and time. He could not protect Harry. That was the thought that kept returning, the one he circled and could not resolve. If the Dementor perimeter was breached, if something happened in the castle in the night, he was Padfoot at the tree line. He was a dog and 2 empty hands, and nothing else. No wand meant no Patronus, and a Patronus was the only thing that repelled Dementors rather than merely putting distance between them. Without one, if the Dementors came in force and came close, he could be near and be completely useless. He had thought about this many times in the past 2 weeks, and had not arrived anywhere new. He wrote the letter while it was still dark, not via Harry's owl. Hedwig was too distinctive, too famous in her way. A snow-white owl associated publicly with Harry Potter, flying messages in and out of Hogwarts would draw attention he could not afford. He used one of Hagrid's owls instead, a large, nondescript brown bird that looked like 100 other post owls and would attract no particular interest. The letter had 3 lines. I'm out. Peter is alive. Come. He addressed it to Remus Lupin, wherever that took it, and sent it. Lupin arrived 9 days later. Sirius heard him on the hillside before he saw him, the sound of boots on frozen ground, careful and unhurried, the footstep of someone following a description rather than a memory. He shifted out of Padfoot form in the back of the cave and stood up, and a moment later, A figure appeared at the cave mouth, and they looked at each other for the first time in 13 years. Lupin was older. That was the first thing, which was obvious and which Sirius had known was coming, but which still arrived as a fact that required several seconds to absorb. Sandy brown hair going grey at the temples and threaded through with more grey than was appropriate for a man of 34, and the robes were shabby in a specific way. Not neglected, carefully maintained, but simply worn through, which was the poverty kind of shabby, and not the carelessness kind. He looked exhausted in a way that went past the journey. He had the look of someone who was exhausted most of the time and had learned to function inside it. Lupin looked at Sirius and was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," he said finally, which was practical and kind, and very Lupin. Sirius sat. Lupin came inside and sat across from him and set his bag down and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed what they were going to say and has now abandoned it. He said, "You look terrible." "I know. I mean," Lupin paused, "I've seen bad. I'm looking at worse." "I know," Sirius said again. He looked at Lupin, at the grey, the worn robes, the dark marks under his eyes that spoke to regular disrupted sleep and the toll it left. "You don't look brilliant yourself." "Wolfsbane is expensive," Lupin said, matter-of-factly. "Without a position, I can't reliably source it. The months I can't get it are—" He made a small gesture. "Anyway." They sat for a moment with 13 years of accumulated silence between them. Then Sirius told him everything, from the goblet to the prophet reaching him in the cell, from the escape to the crossing to the cave, from Hagrid to Harry to the hut and the four of them around the table, and the terrible moment when Ron Weasley held up his rat to the lamp. He told Lupin, "Peter is alive. Peter is hiding at Hogwarts as Ron Weasley's rat. He has been there for 12 years. Lupin listened. His face, while Sirius talked, was doing something controlled and contained, the expression of a man who is processing information too large for his face to hold, and is managing it in sections. When Sirius finished, Lupin was quiet for a long time. "I didn't believe you did it," he said. "I should say that. I never fully believed it. After you disappeared into Azkaban, I told myself I was being sentimental. That the evidence was the evidence. That 12 muggles and a street were not things I could argue with." He looked at his hands, which were folded on his knee. "But I didn't believe it. I didn't act on that, which is different. I'm sorry for the difference." Sirius looked at him. "You couldn't have known about Peter." "No, but I knew you. I should have done something with that." There was nothing useful to say to that, so Sirius said nothing. After a moment, Lupin reached into his robes. He held out a wand. It was 11 inches, cypress, reasonably flexible, not extraordinary, but serviceable, which was what Lupin tended toward in practical matters, choosing the reliable over the remarkable. He held it across his palm toward Sirius, with the quiet directness of someone who has already made the decision and is not interested in debating it. "You need this more than I do right now," he said. "I'll get another from Diagon Alley. Alone. Don't—" A slight pause. "Lose it." Sirius took it. The first wand in 13 years. It was not his. A borrowed wand was imperfect in the hand, resistant in small ways, its allegiance pointed somewhere else. But the weight of it was real. A wand was the difference between capability and its absence. He held it and did not say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Lupin nodded once. "What's tomorrow?" "The first task." Sirius had pieced it together from the tournament coverage. What a something alive in an enclosure meant, given the size of the structure they were building on the grounds. "I'm reasonably certain it's dragons." Lupin absorbed this. "And Harry?" "I've sent word through Hagrid. He knows to use the summoning charm. Call his broom to him." Sirius turned the borrowed wand in his hand. "The Nimbus 2000 isn't a fire bolt, but it's fast enough. The Accio will take time. He'll have to manage without it for a period. He'll manage." He said the last part with more certainty than he felt, which was the only useful thing to do with it. They sat at the cave mouth that night, both of them, looking down at the valley and the lights of Hogwarts. The castle was lit in its particular way. Towers and high windows, the glow of the great hall, the dark shapes on the perimeter, still doing their slow circuit. Tomorrow Harry would go into an enclosure with a Hungarian horntail, and Sirius would be at the tree line with Lupin's wand, and a clear view, and no ability to intervene directly. "Could be worse," Lupin said, after a while. "Barely," Sirius said. Lupin looked at him sideways. The grey at his temples caught the moonlight. "It's good you're here." Sirius looked at the castle. Harry was in there somewhere, in the dormitory, or possibly awake and not sleeping, which would be understandable. He had a godson who was 14 years old, and had carried everything alone until 3 weeks ago, and was going to face a dragon in the morning. "Yes," he said. "I know." He held the wand. In the dark, at the tree line, he could be there. That was something. That was, for now, what there was. November the 24th arrived, grey and cold, the kind of Scottish morning that came in flat and stayed flat, and Harry stood in the champion's waiting tent, listening to the other 3 go through ahead of him. He had practiced the summoning charm in the dormitory for a week. He had practiced it until it felt like something in his arms rather than a thought. He had practiced it until Ron, who was still technically not talking to him then, but was watching anyway, had said, "That's good," under his breath, and then looked away again. Harry had practiced it because Sirius had told him to, via a note passed through Hagrid, and because he did not have another plan, and the thing in the enclosure, he knew it now, everyone knew it now, was a Hungarian horntail. The horntail was the last dragon chosen. He had seen the descriptions in the tournament booklet they'd been issued. The most dangerous of the 4 breeds assigned to this year's task, known for exceptional tail mobility and reach. Harry had folded the booklet in half and put it in his trunk. He heard the crowd through the canvas, a roar for Cedric's Swedish short snout, quieter applause for Crumb's Chinese fireball, the specifically different quality of noise that followed Fleur's Welsh green. Then quiet. Then a marshal at the tent opening saying, "Your turn, Mr. Potter." He walked into the enclosure. The crowd noise hit him, and he did not listen to it. He was looking at the horntail. At the tree line above Hogsmeade, Sirius was Padfoot, and he was still. He had come as close to the Dementor perimeter as he could manage in this form, close enough that the cold of them was at the edge of his awareness, that particular cold that pressed inward rather than sitting on the surface. Beyond that threshold he would not go. A dog's emotional register was simpler, less present to them, but less present was not absent, and the Dementors nearest the tree line had rotated toward him twice in the past hour, and moved on. He was at the outer reach of their perception, and he stayed there, and he didn't move. He could hear the crowd. He could not see the enclosure from this distance. There was a ridge of ground between him and the stadium structure, and the flags above the seating were all he could make out. But the crowd noise carried clearly in the cold air, the surge and drop of it, the roar for each champion, the particular silence before a score. He was navigating by sound alone, which was fitting and infuriating in equal measure. Harry's turn was last. He knew that much. He waited. The horntail was worse than the descriptions. Harry cleared the fence, and the dragon was already moving, wheeling its enormous black head toward him, the yellow eyes tracking, the spiked tail sweeping a wide arc across the rocky ground that would have taken his legs off if he'd been 2 meters closer. It was chained at the neck, which gave him a radius to work with, and he stayed at its edge and bought himself 30 seconds of it before he stopped moving and raised his wand. Accio. Nimbus 2000. He felt the spell leave him, not saw, felt a particular quality in the air between the wand and the direction he was pointing, and then there was nothing to do but move, and not stop moving, and not let the dragon have a clear line at him for more than a second at a time. The wait was the worst part. 30 seconds. 45. The horntail's tail came around, and he threw himself flat, and it passed over him close enough that the wind of it was physical. He rolled left and came up running, and the dragon's head turned, and the yellow eyes found him, and he sprinted in the opposite direction, and threw himself behind the largest boulder he could reach, and pressed his back against it, while the horntail's fire came, a column of orange and black that hit the rock and split around it, and Harry felt the heat on both sides of his face, and kept his head down. Then the sound of his broomstick. He heard it before he saw it. The particular sound a broom makes at speed, the slight resonance. And he turned and caught it without quite meaning to, the handle coming into his palm like it remembered his hand. The Nimbus 2000 was not a firebolt. He knew that the moment he was in the air, the difference in speed and responsiveness registering immediately. But it was his broom, and it was here, and he went up fast and pulled left before the horntail's neck could track him, and the enclosure opened out below. He saw the egg, bronze gold, in the nest among the rocks, the dragon's chain pulling taut as it turned. He did not think after that. He flew. The tactic was simple and brutal. Get the horntail's attention in one direction and come at the egg from another. It took 3 passes, and on the third, the tail found him, clipped his left shoulder, and sent him spinning, broom tilting badly, the crowd noise going strange in his ears. And he hung on and righted himself, and came around in a descending arc, and got his hand on the egg while the horntail was still looking the wrong way. He pulled up. He had the egg, both arms wrapped around it, the broom listing where the tail had caught his shoulder. He circled once, and came down, and landed, and stood on the ground, and found that his hands were shaking. He noticed this, and filed it away for later. Padfoot, at the tree line, heard the sound of 10,000 people going loud at once, and felt something in his chest loosen. He had been still for an hour. He let himself breathe. The roar went on. He closed his eyes briefly. He was in dog form, and in dog form, the emotion was simpler, more immediate, less complicated by everything that complicated it in human form. Harry had the egg. He was not dead. The sound of the crowd said so. He opened his eyes and watched the flags over the distant ridge. The scores went up. High scores, Harry in first place. And the stadium began to empty, thousands of people in motion at once. Ron Weasley was in the middle of it, Hermione just ahead of him, and Scabbers was in his pocket. He had felt Scabbers moving for the past several minutes, more agitated than at any point since the task was announced. Not ordinary nervous fidgeting, but something urgent and focused, the rat's whole body twisting toward the open air. Ron had pushed his hand into his pocket to hold him still, and Scabbers had bitten him hard, breaking skin, which he had never once done in 12 years. And then the crowd had surged, and Ron had stumbled, and his hand had come out of his pocket, automatically to catch himself. The rat was gone before he had processed that his hand had left the pocket. He shoved back through the crowd toward where it had happened, his eyes on the ground, his hand bleeding from the bite. The crowd was too dense and moving too fast in the wrong direction. He shouted Scabbers' name, which was futile. The crowd noise was immense, and then he looked at the ground and saw nothing, and lost him. At the judge's table, the magical blue eye in Moody's face was doing what it always did, moving. Ceiling to grounds, grounds to crowd, crowd to... It stopped, a small grey shape near the ground, moving through the crowd's feet in a way that was not the way a rat moved. Too purposeful, too directed. A normal rat panicked and ran in circles. This one was cutting a line, running for the edge of the grounds with the specific urgency of something that had been frightened for weeks and had finally found a reason to move. The eye tracked it to the tree line and lost it in the roots of the grass. Moody's face did not change expression. He lifted his goblet and drank and watched the champions emerge for the presentation. But the eye continued its slow arc, and the mind behind it was doing something cold and precise, calculating how much had changed and how much could still be salvaged. Ron came to Harry's room that night. He sat on the edge of the bed across from Harry's and looked at his bandaged hand and said, "Scabbers ran." The words fell into the quiet room. Harry looked at Ron. "During the crowd," Ron said. "He bit me and ran. I looked, but..." He stopped. He looked at the window. "He ran. He ran because he's him. Because Sirius was there, at the tree line. And he knew it. He actually ran." "Yeah," Harry said. Ron looked at the bandage on his hand. He looked at it for a long time. "I've had him my whole life," he said, which was not a defense of the rat, and was not grief for the rat either. It was something else, the specific weight of discovering that something you carried for years was not what you thought it was, and the strangeness of that being worse than you expected it to be. "I know," Harry said. Ron nodded once. He sat there a minute longer. Then, "We'll get him back." "Yeah," Harry said. "We will." The rift, such as it still was not there anymore. They had a rat to catch. Ron covered the cage with his transfiguration robe on the morning of November 25th and did not mention it. Harry noticed. Harry did not say anything. The robe sat on top of the empty cage on Ron's bedside table, and nobody touched it for 3 days. And this was the kind of arrangement that forms between people who understand each other without requiring discussion. The problem, when they laid it out in the library, was considerable. "A rat," Hermione said, which was not minimizing the problem but stating it. "In a castle with 7 floors, dungeons, several towers, dozens of staircases that move, and grounds that include a full forbidden forest and a lake." "He won't be in the castle," Harry said. "He ran from the castle. He ran for the tree line. He might come back. Rats come back to familiar territory. He knows Sirius is watching the tree line. He doesn't know where exactly Sirius is." Harry thought about this. It was true. Pettigrew had panicked and run, which meant he had gone toward instinct rather than planning. But instinct for a rat that had been living as a human for 13 years was not simple animal behavior. Peter Pettigrew was intelligent. He was a marauder, however reluctant and however treacherous. He knew how to hide, and he knew how to think. "The map," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "Does it?" "Fred and George gave it to me in 3rd year. It shows every person in the castle." He had not used it much this year, had not needed it, or had been too preoccupied. He pulled it from his bag and unfolded it on the table. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." The lines spread across the parchment in their familiar ink, the castle unfolding corridor by corridor, room by room, staircase and dormitory and secret passage. Hundreds of labeled dots moving in the way they always moved. Purposeful, slow, crossing paths, going in and out of rooms. Harry ran his finger across the parchment, section by section, the entrance hall, the dungeons, the Gryffindor Tower, every floor. He looked for a dot labelled Peter Pettigrew. It was not there. "He's outside the castle," Harry said. "The map covers the interior. If he's in the forest, or on the grounds beyond the walls—" "It won't show him," Hermione finished. They sat with that for a moment. The forest was enormous, old-growth trees and creatures that would not distinguish between a regular rat and a man-rat hiding in their undergrowth. Pettigrew could stay out there for weeks on rodent instinct and not be found by anything short of a trained tracking animal. "We need Sirius on the grounds," Harry said. Hagrid opened the gate. It was a section of the perimeter fence near the pumpkin patch, far enough from the lakeside Dementor posts that the guards didn't maintain a continuous line there. Hagrid had the authority of a groundskeeper. His keys opened things at the ground's edge that weren't formally locked against anything, just locked against the casual. A large black dog slipping through at 11:30 at night in the fog was not casual, but it was quiet, and Hagrid pulled the gate closed and watched it go and went back inside his hut. Sirius began tracking. In Padfoot form, with his nose working through the layers of the grounds, it was immediately clear that the trail was everywhere and nowhere. Pettigrew had been in the castle for 3 years in this body. His scent was on the grass by the herbology greenhouses, near the Whomping Willow, along the base of the castle walls where a small animal would logically run for shelter. 3 years of Ron Weasley carrying him to class, to meals, out to the grounds. The trail was the castle and everything around it. He worked outward in expanding circles, trying to find the freshest line, the specific thread that was the night of November 24th, rather than the accumulated years. He found it eventually, near the Forbidden Forest edge. A thin, recent line, moving fast, heading into the trees. He followed it in. The forest at night was dark in the way that forests with no ambient light are dark, completely, directionlessly, and he moved by nose and paw feel rather than sight. The trail went 100 meters into the tree line, and then stopped. Not ended. Stopped. The scent dropped out abruptly, in a way that scent did not naturally do, as though something had been laid across the trail to mask it, a heavy blocking smell that pressed the real scent flat. He circled the dead spot 3 times. Nothing beyond it. The trail was gone. He sent word to Harry the following morning, through Hagrid's channel. The trail has been cut. Not lost. Cut. Someone is interfering. Someone inside the castle knows where Pettigrew went and is masking the scent. This is deliberate. The reply came back that evening. Who? Which was the right question, and he did not have an answer yet. In Hagrid's hut, 3 nights after the first task, Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat around the table with the map open in front of them and the problem of the dead trail. "It has to be someone with access to the grounds at night," Hermione said. "Someone who could move without being questioned. And whoever it is has enough magical capability to mask a scent trail, which is not a common skill." "And they knew the trail existed," Harry said, "which means they knew Pettigrew ran. They were watching." Ron had been quiet, his elbows on the table. He said, "Moody." They looked at him. "He's been watching us all term. That eye of his goes through walls, through the cloak. He saw us coming to Hagrid's hut. He would have seen Pettigrew run. He would have seen Padfoot on the grounds." Ron's expression was flat and certain, the face of someone who has worked through a thing and arrived somewhere he doesn't like. If you wanted to track where a dog was following a scent and put something in the way, you'd need to know exactly where the dog was. You'd need an eye that can see through trees and stone and 200 meters of forest. There's only one person in this castle with that. Nobody disagreed. The silence that followed, had the quality of something settling. Sirius was at the cave mouth when Harry's letter came, via Hagrid's owl at first light. He read it. He sat with it for a while, the way he had sat with the prophet in the cell, reading it twice, making sure his mind had processed what it said before he committed to a response. Moody. Harry suspected Moody. He thought about Alastair Moody, the Moody he had known, the one who had been in the Order during the First War, who had appeared in the old photograph that Harry had apparently never seen. Moody was not a gentleman, was not a patient man, but he was not a man who would protect Peter Pettigrew. He was constitutionally incapable of it. He had spent his career hunting dark wizards and the people who worked with them. If Moody knew Pettigrew was alive and hiding in a rat's body in a schoolboy's pocket, Moody would have had the rat on a table in 5 minutes. This man was watching them. This man had covered Pettigrew's trail. This man had Moody's eye and Moody's voice, and was not Moody. He wrote back. The letter was short. Moody was order. First war. I knew him. He would not protect Pettigrew, not for any reason. The man you're watching is not Moody. Something is wrong. Be careful who you tell. He sent it with Hagrid's owl and sat for a long time in the mouth of the cave, looking at the lights of the castle, thinking about what it meant to be wrong about a person, in one direction or another, and what that wrongness cost. The scent changed on the 2nd of December. Sirius had been working the grounds in long arcs for a week, coming in through Hagrid's gate each night after midnight, moving in padfoot form through the dark, the lake edge, the forest margin, the shadows of the greenhouses, trying to find a trail that had not been masked. Most of them had. Whatever was being used to suppress the scent worked broadly, covering wide sections of ground with a blanket of nothing that a dog's nose read as absence. But near the Whomping Willow, where the ground rose slightly before the tunnel entrance that he had not used in 13 years, he found a different quality of nothing, not suppressed, avoided. The area around the willow had its own kind of blankness, a place the masking had not touched, because perhaps whoever was doing the masking did not know what the willow meant, or did not want to approach it. And beneath the absence, barely, the ghost of a recent trail. He had followed it as far as he could. It came from the forest edge, approached the willow in a wide, uncertain loop, and vanished into the ground near the base of the trunk. Peter had found the tunnel. Sirius sent word at first light. The willow. Tonight. Harry read the letter at breakfast, under the table, folded inside a bit of parchment that looked like an essay. He passed it to Hermione. She read it and folded it very small and tucked it away. He caught Ron's eye across the table. Ron nodded once. The note did not explain how to get through the Whomping Willow, but Sirius had told Harry 2 weeks prior, in a letter that Harry had since memorized. There was a knot on the trunk, at roughly knee-height if you approached from the south. Press it firmly with something long enough that your arm was not in reach of the branches. The tree froze. The roots opened. The passage was below. They went after 11, under the cloak, taking a long branch from the kindling pile at the back of Hagrid's woodshed. The night was cold and very clear, the kind of December night that had no ambiguity about it, and the Whomping Willow was visible from halfway across the grounds, enormous and entirely still, which Whomping Willows only were when there was no wind and nothing moving near them. They got closer. The nearest branch twitched. Now, Harry said, and Hermione jabbed the end of the branch toward the base of the trunk with both hands, the branch catching the knot at the second try, and the tree went rigid as though someone had thrown a switch. Every branch. The roots uncoiled from around the hidden entrance. The cloak came off, and they folded it into Harry's bag and went down. The tunnel was long and low and smelled of earth and old stone, they went in single file, Harry first, Ron at the back, jaw set, not speaking. Behind Harry he could hear Hermione's careful breathing, steady and deliberate, the sound of someone managing something. The shrieking shack was at the other end. Harry had known it was abandoned. He had not known what abandoned meant, precisely, until the tunnel opened up into the first room. The smell of years of disuse, of wood going soft in the damp, of something past rot into a kind of structural exhaustion. The windows were boarded, the wallpaper hung in strips, the furniture that remained, a chair, a low table, a frame that had been a bed, had the grey look of things left too long in a place with no light. Sirius stood in the middle of the room with Lupin's wand. In the far corner, under the broken bed frame, a small grey shape was crouched. It was hunched into itself, motionless, with the specific quality of a small animal that has run out of directions. "It's all right," Sirius said, without looking away from the corner. His voice was quiet and entirely controlled, which was its own kind of alarming. "He knows. He's been here for 2 days. He hasn't transformed because he thinks if he stays small enough, long enough, I'll leave." He said this to the rat. "I won't leave, Peter." The grey shape trembled. Then it changed. The transformation was not smooth. It never was. Not when the animagus was forced rather than willing. And the shape that came up from under the bed frame was small and pale and wet-eyed in the lamplight, with pointed features and the general look of a man who had spent 13 years surviving in a rat's body and had not, in all that time, found a way to be comfortable in either form. He was shaking. He looked around the room and saw Sirius, and his face did several things in rapid succession, all of them servile. "Sirius," he said. "Sirius, I can explain. You have to understand. I had no choice. I was frightened. He would have killed me." Sirius said nothing. "You know what he was like. You know. We all knew. I was in over my head. I never wanted." Sirius looked at him. Just looked. 13 years of a cell, and his best friend's deaths, and Harry growing up at the Dursleys not knowing. All of it was in that look. And what made it worse than anger, what made it harder to watch than anything that could have been shouted, was that it was still. Pettigrew's voice ran down. He looked at the floor. The sound of feet in the tunnel. Harry came through first, then Hermione, then Ron. Ron stopped when he saw the figure on the floor. Stopped completely, one hand on the tunnel entrance, and the rest of him frozen, and looked at Peter Pettigrew on 2 legs, at a man where a rat had been for 12 years. Hermione had gone white-faced, but was watching steadily, her hand in her robe near her own wand. Harry stood beside Sirius and assessed the room the way Harry assessed things, quickly, comprehensively, already planning. Sirius raised the wand. The motion was not dramatic. It was tired. 13 years, and everything, and the man on the floor who had made himself small and rat-shaped to survive, while everything he had destroyed stayed destroyed. The wand came up to pointing height, and Sirius's hand was steady. "He's worth more alive," Harry said, quietly. Not a plea, a calculation, delivered in a voice that was already somewhere past the feeling and into the logic. "You know he is. Alive, he's your proof. Dead, he's nothing." A long moment. Sirius lowered the wand. It cost him something visible. The steadiness remained, but something underneath it shifted. A held breath released, a thing set down that was heavier than it looked. He stood for a moment, and then he crouched and bound Pettigrew's wrists with the wand, a quick, efficient conjuration, and stood back up. Pettigrew did not speak again. He sat with his bound wrists in his lap and looked at the floor. Lupin arrived 15 minutes later, coming through the tunnel entrance with the hurried steps of someone who had seen the willow freeze from across the valley and moved immediately. He looked at Pettigrew. He looked at Sirius. He said, with a very careful flatness, "Good." They stood in the shrieking shack with their prisoner and looked at each other, and eventually Hermione said what they were all thinking. "We can't take him across the open grounds. Not to Dumbledore's office. Not like this. If a ministry official sees Sirius with a bound man in the dark, nothing else matters. They respond to Sirius first." She had the look she got when she was solving a problem that had no good solution and was looking for the least bad one. "We need a plan. We need to take him somewhere, in front of people, where the sequence of events cannot be reordered." "Dumbledore," Lupin said. "The office isn't public, but Dumbledore himself is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. If he witnesses—" "He has to see it before he can call anyone else in," Harry said. "He sees it, he acts. In the right order." Pettigrew, on the floor, did not contribute. They stood in the ruined room with the boarded windows and the smell of 30 years of disuse, and worked out how to carry a man across a castle without the wrong people seeing him first. They came out of the tunnel one at a time, into the cold, and the grounds were dark and empty and smelled of frost. And then they weren't empty. Moody stood 20 feet from the whomping willow. He stood very still, which was unusual for a man who moved constantly, and the magical blue eye in his scarred face was not doing its usual sweep of the grounds. It was fixed on Pettigrew, who was walking bound between Sirius and Lupin, stumbling slightly, his wrists tied in front of him. "I'll take him from here," Moody said. The voice was right, rough, veteran, carrying clearly across the cold air. But the tone was not. The tone had the specific quality of a person saying something they have rehearsed, rather than something they mean. "Ministry business. I'll see he's processed properly." He raised his wand, and Pettigrew's bound body lifted off the ground. "Put him down," Sirius said. Moody's magical eye moved to him. The real eye stayed on the floating prisoner. "Black, you've done well. Stand down, and let the ministry handle the rest." I said, "Put him down." A silence on the December grounds, the kind that has weather in it. Sirius stepped forward until he was between Moody and Pettigrew, and he raised his borrowed wand and looked at the man in front of him. He had thought about this. He had written it in a letter to Harry 9 days ago, and he said it now to the face. Moody was order. First war. I knew him. Moody would not protect Peter Pettigrew. He would not cover a scent trail. He would not shield a Death Eater. A beat. "Who are you?" The blue eye stopped moving. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the face changed. Not suddenly. Polyjuice didn't release suddenly. It unwound, the borrowed features softening and sliding back like wax near heat, the bulk of the body shrinking, the scarred face resolving into something younger and less damaged, the magical eye remaining where it was, because it was not part of the transformation, but a prosthetic that could be removed and replaced. What was left was a young man, late 20s or early 30s, sharp-faced, with the specific look of someone who has been living on a knife edge for long enough that calm had become a performance. Bartemius Crouch Jr. looked at Sirius across the dark grounds and made a decision. "It doesn't matter," he said. His voice was his own now, and it was different from Moody's. Lighter, faster, with an edge that Moody's deliberate rasp had covered. "The plan is already broken. You broke it. The rat was supposed to stay hidden, and the cup was supposed to take the boy to my master at the end of the tournament, and you've destroyed both of those things so." He smiled, which was the wrong response to his situation, and he seemed to know it, and not care. None of it matters now except that I'm not letting Peter Pettigrew reach the ministry. He cast. The spell hit the air between them, and Sirius deflected it. Barely. The borrowed wand, dragging against the motion in a way his own wand never had. Lupin Cypress not entirely willing in a stranger's grip. He threw a counter-curse back, and Crouch dodged it, and fired again, and the whomping willow behind them shuddered back to life, and a branch came down on nothing. Sirius fought the way a man fights when he hasn't dueled in 13 years, on knowledge rather than reflex, calling up the mechanics of combat from a part of his memory that Azkaban had not quite dimmed. The wand fought him. He fought through the wand. He was slower than he should have been, and he knew it, and he compensated with reach, staying at distance, not letting Crouch get the close quarters angle. Harry was beside him before he'd consciously registered it. He was 14, and he had grown up doing impossible things by instinct, and he fought without the elegant form of a trained duelist, but with the same absolute focus he'd had in the enclosure with the horn tail. Present, fast, reading the next second rather than the current one. He threw disarming charms in rapid succession, and Crouch had to split his attention to block them, and splitting his attention cost him. Lupin came in from the left. He had a new wand, bought in the week since he'd lent his to Sirius, and it moved differently, more settled, more matched, and he was a trained defense professor who had spent a year teaching the theory of combat to fourth years, and theory and practice were not as far apart as people assumed. 3 against 1, on an open field, with the one already managing 2 flanks. Crouch took a stunning spell from Lupin, and it caught him across the shoulder and staggered him, and Harry's Expelliarmus came in the same instant from the other angle, and his wand left his hand, and Sirius's binding spell closed around his wrists before he hit the ground. The grounds went quiet. Dumbledore came across the grass from the castle. He had come down on foot at something faster than a walk, and Harry could see the moment he had arrived. The spellfire would have been visible from the astronomy tower, where, apparently, he had been standing when the whomping willow froze. The tree never froze on its own. He had come down at once. He stood now at the edge of the scene with his hands at his sides, and his half-moon spectacles catching the moonlight, and he looked at everything before he spoke. He looked at Sirius. He looked at Pettigrew, still floating bound where Crouch's spell had left him. He looked at Bartemius Crouch Jr. on the ground. He looked at the wand lying on the frost-hard grass. "Come inside," he said. His voice carried without effort. Dumbledore's office at 2 a.m. was lit and warm, the portraits of previous headmasters asleep in their frames, the sorting hat on its shelf. They came in a group, Sirius and Lupin on either side of Pettigrew, Harry and Hermione and Ron behind. Crouch Jr. revived, and walking under a binding spell, Dumbledore ahead of all of them. The Veritaserum was 3 drops in a glass of water, clear and odorless, administered by Dumbledore himself with the precision of a man who had done this before and found it necessary rather than pleasant. Crouch drank it. He told them everything, his identity, how his father had smuggled him out of Azkaban, substituting a dying woman in his place, the polyjuice working both ways, how he had ambushed the real Alastair Moody before the school year began, imprisoned him in his own magical trunk in the office below, how he had spent the year as Moody, redosing on polyjuice every hour, managing the tournament to funnel Harry toward the Portkey Cup. What the Portkey would have delivered? A graveyard. A ritual requiring Harry's blood and a servant's flesh. His master, given back a body. "The trunk," Dumbledore said, when Crouch had finished. They went downstairs. The real Alastair Moody was in the 7th compartment of his own trunk, in the dark. Alive and in a state of compressed fury, that 13 years in Azkaban and then several months in a box had evidently not diminished. He had one real eye and the socket where the magical eye had been, and a wooden leg, and a face so comprehensively scarred it was difficult to read his expression. But the expression was fury exactly, directed at the room in general, and at Crouch specifically once he understood the situation. "I should have known," he said, which was the first thing he said, a statement aimed at himself rather than anyone else. Dumbledore sent a Patronus, a silver phoenix form, brilliant in the office's dimness, to the ministry. Cornelius Fudge arrived at 3 a.m, with 3 auras and a face that was working very hard at controlled authority. He walked into the office, which now contained a bound and magically silenced Bartemius Crouch Jr., a bound Peter Pettigrew, a battered and furious Alastair Moody sitting in a conjured chair, Dumbledore standing beside his desk, Sirius Black, and 4 Hogwarts students. He looked at all of it. His eyes went to Sirius last, and stayed there. The bowler hat was held in both hands. He had taken it off, which Fudge sometimes did when confronting something he was not ready for. He looked at Sirius and said nothing for a long moment. His expression was the expression of a minister calculating what it would cost him to say the words he was now going to have to say, in what order, to whom, and what version of events made the calculation balance. "Well," said Fudge eventually. The word was doing considerable work. Dumbledore waited. Below, at the edge of the grounds in his hut, Hagrid was asleep over the remains of a self-made cake. He had turned 66 at midnight and made himself a small celebration that he intended to mention to no one. He had been asleep for an hour when something moved on the roof above his bed. Footsteps, light and quick, that might have been a large cat or a fox or the castle settling. He did not investigate. He turned over and went back to sleep. December the 6th. In the castle above, things were being resolved. Peter Pettigrew, under Veritaserum, was worse than any of them had expected, not because he was dramatic about it. He was the opposite of dramatic, his voice small and flat and careful, the voice of a man who has given up on the particular hope of being believed, but because the things he said were things that, once said aloud, in an official room with a ministry recorder present and 2 auras as witnesses, could not be unsaid. He had told Voldemort where the Potters were hiding. He had done it because he was frightened. He said this several times, in varying forms, as though repetition made it into something more defensible, and because Voldemort would have found out, eventually, and he had wanted to be on the right side of that. He had faked his death in the street. He had blown up the road. He had cut off his own finger and transformed and lived as a rat in the Weasley family from that November to this one. 12 years, first with the older boys and then with Ron. He had done it because, as a rat, he was invisible, and invisible was the only kind of safe available. He said all of this in the same flat voice. He looked at the table while he said it. Fudge convened the Wizengamot session 4 days later. He moved quickly, which Harry had not expected, but which Dumbledore apparently had. Dumbledore had, with the polite efficiency of a man who knew exactly how long institutions take to act when properly incentivized, spent those 4 days making it evident to the minister that the evidence was not going to become less embarrassing with time. There was no conviction to overturn. There had never been a trial. What the Wizengamot recorded on the 7th of December 1994 was an acknowledgement that Sirius Orion Black had been imprisoned in Azkaban for 12 years and 8 months on the basis of no trial, no verdict, and no charge proven before a wizarding court. That Peter Pettigrew, not Sirius Black, had committed the crimes for which Sirius had been imprisoned, and that Sirius Black was, and had always been, innocent of all charges. The Wizengamot read this into the record. Fudge signed it. He signed it without meeting Sirius's eyes. The real Moody gave his testimony from a chair conjured for him beside the Wizengamot's witness podium, because he was not yet steady on the replacement leg Madame Pomfrey had sourced. He had been ambushed in his home on the 1st of September, he said, and had been in the trunk since. His voice was as rough as always, and his real eye, the one that was his own, was fixed and clear, and he gave his account with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his career constructing testimonies and knew exactly how each detail needed to land. It was a matter of record. It was also, clearly, a matter of deep personal affront that he had been impersonated for an entire school year, and no one had noticed until now, including himself. He did not say this. His expression did. Harry received the information that he was still bound to compete in the tournament from Dumbledore, in the office, on the morning after the Wizengamot session. He received it the way he received most of the large structural facts of his life, without the surprise that a less battered person might have felt, with the specific kind of equanimity that comes from having learned that the rules tend to apply to you in full. "The cup will be reset," Dumbledore said. "The Portkey enchantment has been removed and will not be reinstated. The tournament continues as the tournament, a contest among 3 schools, with 3 tasks and 4 champions. What it was never supposed to be is now removed." Harry nodded. Voldemort, Dumbledore said carefully, would be looking for another way. Pettigrew in Ministry custody was a significant disruption to the plan that had been unfolding. The specific ritual that had required Pettigrew was no longer available. What came next was uncertain. It was not over. Harry knew this, and Dumbledore knew Harry knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "The second task is February 24th, Dumbledore said. "You have time." Harry nodded again. Sirius had 12 Grimmauld Place. This was the fact that emerged from the paperwork and the legal arrangements over the days that followed. The house at Grimmauld Place in London was his inheritance, left to him by his mother, by the absence of any other heir, which was a kind of final gift that neither of them had intended. It was large and dark, and had not been properly occupied in years. Creature, the family house elf, was apparently still there, maintaining it in whatever way house elves maintained empty homes. He could not live openly yet. The world adjusted to information slowly, and Sirius Black as a free man, rather than a fugitive, would take time to become real for everyone who had seen the wanted posters. But he had a house. He had a wand. He had Lupin, who was coming to London in the new year and had accepted, with the minimal fuss that characterized Lupin's acceptance of most things, the spare room on the 2nd floor. In the summers, for as long as the blood protection held, Harry would need to return to the Dursleys for a period each year. Dumbledore had explained this carefully. But in the summers, Harry could come to Grimmauld Place. He could come for the whole summer. Dumbledore had stepped out of the office. Harry did not know for how long. He did not know if Dumbledore had stepped out intentionally. Probably he had. Probably this was the kind of thing Dumbledore arranged without appearing to. And it did not matter. The fire was burning low, and the portraits were asleep, and Sirius was sitting across from him in a chair he had pulled close to the hearth. He was thinner than he should have been, in a borrowed cloak Hagrid had pressed on him from the back of a cupboard that smelled of Hagrid's hut. He was 35 years old. He looked like someone who was learning to take up space again after learning not to. "I always thought you'd write," Harry said, "when I was little. The years at the Dursleys." He was not sure why he said this first, rather than anything else. It was not the most important thing, probably, but it was the thing that came out. "I thought someone would write." Sirius was very still. "I was in a place," he said, "where paper doesn't last long." He did not elaborate. The fire popped once. Harry looked at it and thought about what that sentence contained and what it did not say. "Yeah," he said. "I know." They sat for a while, in the low light of Dumbledore's office, with the fire going down, and the portraits sleeping, and the castle quiet around them. There was a great deal more to say. There was, between them, about 13 years of things to say. And none of it needed to happen right now, tonight, in this room. It would happen. There was time for it now in a way there had not been before. In the morning, they went outside. The frost was on the grass, the kind of hard December frost that stiffened every blade and made the ground shine slightly in the early light. Harry was in his Gryffindor robes. Sirius was in Hagrid's borrowed cloak, which was slightly too large at the shoulders and considerably too large everywhere else, but it was warm and it was a thing to wear outdoors in December, when the alternative was nothing. He shifted to Padfoot, somewhere between the castle steps and the edge of the grounds. The transformation was as easy and instinctive as it had always been, the only thing Azkaban had not been able to take, and the dog that appeared beside Harry was large and black and moved through the frost-stiff grass with the particular quality of something that is finally exactly where it is supposed to be. Harry walked. Padfoot walked beside him. The castle rose behind them, and the grounds spread out ahead, and the Black Lake was dark and still at the field's edge, and on the far side of the valley the hills were the pale brown of December hills. Nothing was finished. The second task was in February. Voldemort was in the world somewhere, in whatever diminished form he now occupied. Ron was still processing what it meant to have carried Peter Pettigrew in his pocket for 12 years. The tournament was ongoing. The paperwork of Sirius's life was incomplete. But the morning was here, and the frost was on the grass, and Padfoot's shoulder was warm against Harry's leg as they walked. That was something,